I would love to introduce everybody to my close friend, Caverly Morgan, who's going to be speaking with us today. She is a spiritual teacher, someone I actually met on a meditation retreat. She's a nonprofit founder. She founded Peace in Schools, which is an amazing nonprofit that teaches kids mindfulness in primarily the Portland Public School District. She is author. She's written 2 books. One is The Heart of Who We Are, Realizing Freedom Together, which I have to admit made me cry when I wrote it. It's so good. It talks about not only spiritual practice, but bringing in social justice to our spiritual practice. She's also written a book called A Kid's Book About Mindfulness, which really explains the principles of mindfulness to kids in amazingly simple terms. So she's also an ex-monk. She actually began her practice in the Zen tradition in 1995, and she had a shaved head and everything. And she spent 8 years in a Zen monastery, and she's been teaching contemplative practice really since 2001. So she leads workshops, she leads retreats, she teaches internationally. And the reason I have her on here is because not only are we friends, we've really teamed up. The ideas, I went to her for really help and just the desire for collaboration on asking the question, who is the self in self-compassion? How might an understanding of the self inform self-compassion practice? And we are teaching a workshop together this coming June, I think it's June 7th and 8th in Santa Monica. And if you want to learn more about Caverly, you can find her online at caverlymorgan.org. But you don't have to do that right now because she's here with us. So thank you so much, Caverly, for joining me on this guest conversation.
Kristin, I'm, as you know, delighted and honored, and I'm tickled to be here with this group of people. So thank you all for coming. Kristin and I talk all the time, so to have you get to join our conversation makes it special.
Yeah, and so one of the things I want to ask you about, Caverly, is you were a monk. You were a pretty hardcore monk. And often in the Zen tradition, and when I think of Zen, normally I don't think of the word self-compassion. I think of it more as like a disciplined approach. But you had a slightly different experience. I mean, you're one of the, I wouldn't say few teachers, but you are a teacher who really puts self-compassion at the front and center of the work you do. So can you tell us a little bit about your experience as a monk, and particularly how self-compassion came into your practice?
Yeah, thank you, Kristin. I feel very fortunate that I trained with someone who brought a lot of attention to how the mind works. Now, most people would say that in any monastic tradition, that's one of the things you're paying attention to is how the mind works. But she, the teacher I trained with, gave me a lot of language for how the mind has processes that prior to training I didn't recognize. For example, how my self-talk, my internal dialogue, was primarily negative. That was something I wasn't conscious of before training. I feel very fortunate that I trained in a setting where we not only were taught to recognize that negative self-talk, we were taught how to meet that negative self-talk differently than we're habituated to. Then I can meet it if I'm not paying attention to it.
Yeah, so you talk about the compassionate mentor. Is that where you first learned about it?
It is. We were trained to be able to place the attention where you want it to be without judgment. So basic mindfulness practice, but we were also trained, we were supported in placing the attention on what the mind's doing regarding, for example, negative self-talk, and then learning how to access the compassionate mentor within, the unconditionally loving, compassionate mentor within that can embrace, hold, accept, and I don't want to say combat because it didn't ever feel combative when I was learning to do it, but counteract some of the internal negative dialogue that I was so, again, habituated to.
And then what happened when you got out? Can you tell us a little bit about Peace in Schools, and also the role that self-compassion plays in that program, which is just such an amazing program.
Yeah, I feel so blessed that what I learned through Peace in Schools were that teens were like sponges for these practices of self-compassion. So the reason I ended up in a school is because I had done a workshop for adults about the inner critic and how to work with the inner critic and how to access unconditional love and acceptance via, as you said, this form of the compassionate mentor. A teacher came to me who was who's one of the participants and said, my teens in the high school I work in need what you just did. They need these tools. And so things took off from there, and she invited me into her school, and I saw immediately that the teenagers were actually, they exhibited a level of openness to what I was sharing that really surpassed some of the resistances that I found in working with adults. And it was just so moving to me. And that's how things took off. And since we've begun the program, we have learned that one of our strengths is actually supporting teens in recognizing that they're worthy, that they can find unconditional love, that it's something that they can practice being in relationship with this unconditional, the loving mentor that's just always there. We saw that that's one of the places we excelled.
And then right now, so you're in the Portland School District, but you're expanding to California, is that right? And it's true that you're the only 4-credit mindfulness program that I'm aware
So
of?
we created that we know of, we created the country's first semester-long credited course in which, as you know, Kristin, self-compassion is a huge element, a huge component. And this semester-long course, we spent about 10 years in Portland in a direct service model, contemplatives that I would hire going into the classrooms. Now we're flipping our model. We're training educators in schools to share this curriculum with students. And as we do that, we're able to expand. So we're in several schools in California, starting in the fall. We're in more schools in Oregon and beyond, hopefully in our future.
World domination next, right? Okay, and then so now I want to get into the stuff that's a little more challenging to understand, but you're so good at it. So I will tell everyone. So I met you at a retreat taught by a man named Rupert Spira, who teaches non-duality. So I've been interested in something called non-duality, kind of some people may be familiar with the word. For some people, it's like, what does that mean? And this is something that I've been fascinated by, and you are in many ways a non-dual teacher. I know it's not, you don't limit yourself to that word, but can you explain what you mean by not only the word non-duality, and sometimes I hear you describe it as our true nature. What's that? And pretend I'm a high school student, one of your classes that you're talking to.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because what we do in our high school curriculum is we support teens in recognizing how the mind is habituated to see things in dualistic terms. So what I mean by that is the mind, if you pay attention just throughout one day to how the mind works, you're going to see that it's setting things up in opposition all day long. Black, white, good, bad, this, that, right, wrong. So we first bring attention to how is the mind doing that? And then we bring attention to, and then who do I become in relationship to the mind doing that? So for example, maybe I become someone who's a little anxious. I remember a high school student coming to me crying after we went over the lesson called duality and saying, I had no idea that I just thought this world of should I go to college, should I not go to college was all there was. And there was either going to be a right or a wrong. But I have been completely freaked out and stressed, bouncing back and forth in that duality. So we start there. First, let's see, how is duality structured? Then we trace it back a little bit. For example, in this moment, we could all pay attention to where is this experience of duality being perceived from. So we begin by drawing back, tracing back. But in simplest terms, Kristin, I like to think of non-duality as not two. So we are habituated to say black, white, this, that, right, wrong, good, bad. What's beyond the not two? That's where we start to explore non-dual.
And then can you talk a little bit about how the sense of self, or maybe true nature, comes into that as well? Because it's more just than recognizing opposites. It's really about understanding our connection and the fact that the self isn't as separate as we may think it is.
Exactly. Because if I can see that who I become, in a sense, in relationship to duality is a part of me who's very anxious, for example, and then I can recognize that that's just a part of me, I start to get in touch with what's bigger than that part of me. So, Kristin, you and I love this language of big self. What is this big self that's embracing a small part of me that's having this dualistic experience, right? So as we bring the attention into big self, we start to get a sense of what's larger, what can hold duality, what's beyond duality. And that's where we get in touch with, as you know, I like to use this phrase of the heart of who we are. That's where we get in touch with a big self that's beyond the limitation of small mind or limited thinking or personal self.
Right. So I mean, I guess the way that I understand it, and correct me if you see it differently, is the kind of thoughts, emotions, which are often negative, which are often, feelings of inadequacy, painful, sometimes pleasant. I mean, they aren't bad. This is our personality, but our thoughts, sensations, emotions, or you might say part of this personal self that's limited, that feels separate from the rest of the world, that feels separate from others. And awareness itself is kind of the holder of this big self, which is naturally compassionate. Would you
Yes.
agree with that description, or embellish on it?
Yes, I mean, I think that's why I love the title of this upcoming workshop we're doing, Who is the Self and Self-Compassion? We rarely pause to question that. So even as a monastic, I spent a lot of time focusing on how I could meet this negative self-talk in an unconditionally loving way, how to work with it, how to practice it. But it took me years to move into this deep question of, well, what is doing that? Where is this unconditionally loving sense of reassurance coming from? That was a different experience than simply training my mind to not go down the road of negative thinking.
Right. And then so what we're doing together, just so people on this call can know, and again, you may have some questions about it, is and again, I want you, Caverly, to jump in with your thoughts on this. Is so it always struck me that people often struggle with self-compassion practice because they're using their more limited sense of self, which feels inadequate, which is, doesn't feel up to the task or doesn't feel worthy. They're trying to give themselves compassion from this more limited sense of self. And yet, when you think about when we're giving compassion to other people, we don't even think about where the compassion is coming from. It just flows. We'll kind of naturally get into that bigger sense of unconditionally compassionate self. And we don't have a problem with it. It just arises very naturally. We don't have to think like, how am I going to be compassionate to my friend? It just comes out. And partly it's because they're you might say flipping into the perspective of big self when compassion is flowing. And so with when we look at who is the self and self-compassion, the idea is that the self-giving compassion is more the big self, and the self-receiving compassion is the one that suffers, which feels limited and separate. And so please add in anything you want to that basic framework.
Yeah, Kristin, I'm in complete agreement. And as you've heard me mention before, but I think it's worth naming here, when I was training monastically to lead retreats called There's Nothing Wrong with You retreats, where we're supporting others in recognizing this negative self-talk, practicing with how to work with it, I was always trained to recognize that the most important movement the participant can make is moving into the role of the unconditionally loving mentor. It actually, according to my teacher, was more important than being reassured. So then having the young part of me who is struggling be reassured in a specific moment. That's very, very important. But to feel ourselves as big self, to recognize ourselves as big self, to recognize ourselves as that which can embrace what is without condition, that's where the magic happens. That's where we're returning to the heart of who we are. And that's where we experience our inherent freedom versus I'm striving to be free. Oh no, I'm identified with small, personal, limited self, and I'm tired now. I can't give compassion anymore. I don't want to do this practice. It's overwhelming. It's too much. This kid doesn't deserve it anyway, right? Whatever thing we might get stuck on.
Yeah, and I love it. You said, well, we're striving to be free because you're a meditation teacher. So a lot of people going on retreat with you might have, maybe big spiritual goals, but people who come to a self-compassion workshop may have a much simpler agenda, which is simply to be a little kinder to themselves. But again, this feeling of effort, like, how do I do it? I don't know how to do it, or I'm not worthy of doing it. Once they actually adopt this bigger sense of self, which again naturally arises in many other contexts for others, then suddenly it becomes a lot easier. Yeah.
It becomes easier because it's our nature. As
okay,
you
can you expand on that?
Yeah.
I love that.
So compassion, love, connection, as you pointed out in the beginning, the felt experience of those things are byproducts of resting in who we truly are. And we know this, Kristin, because you described the friend situation. I always like to use the example of you're falling in love. You don't ask yourself, well, how long do I have to love this person? Am I going to have to practice compassion with them for a really long time? Like it's overflowing because we're falling in love. Because we're recognizing our shared being. We're recognizing that deep sense of when we're falling in love, we're clear. It's not, you're not one, I'm not two. There's this recognition that there's something on the deepest level that we actually share. And when we're really in love, that sense of separation falls away. That's why we love being in love so much, because we get to feel that sense of separation falling away.
Yeah. And then, so some people may know when I develop my model of self-compassion, there's the three components. There's the mindful awareness, there's the kindness, but there's also this common humanity component. And I had learned about self-compassion from Thich Nhat Hanh, who describes this as interbeing, this sense of interconnectedness. And so in a way, it's always been in my model. But normally I teach it more in simplistic terms. Remember, you aren't the only one with a situation like this. Other people are like you. You aren't alone. But what you're doing here is you're expanding it to really talk about that at a deeper level, we're interconnected at the level of, and this is where it doesn't have to be spiritual. It can be spiritual. It can even just be totally biological. We're all mammals. We're all living organisms on the earth. But yeah, so I'm curious if you could say anything more about interbeing. I don't know if you know that concept from Thich Nhat Hanh and how that relates to what you're talking about.
Yeah, happy to. The reason I don't use the phrase interconnected more often, I don't have a problem with the phrase, but the reason it doesn't naturally arise from me to say a lot is it, on a subtle level, it can still imply two. So these glasses are interconnected with the glasses case. So it's still implying that objects are becoming connected or maybe are inherently connected. There's truth to that. As you're saying, mycelium, look at nature. We can point to all kinds of places where we recognize interconnection. But I love this phrase, shared being. And as you know, Kristin, I use that one a lot. I don't think it's a requirement. I don't think it's necessarily the best phrase, but it's the one that feels most authentic for me because it feels most representative of supporting the recognition of what's underneath the objects. If I call the glasses case an object and the glass is an object, or your body mind called Kristin and Caverly's body mind as two different objects, how can we point to what's under the objects? What's sort of infusing the objects? What's making up the objects? What's animating the objects? To me, and I agree with you, that doesn't have to be a quote unquote spiritual discussion. This isn't a woo-woo thing. This is asking, as you pointed out in the beginning about awareness, what's underneath? What's the backdrop of these objects? What's enlivening the objects? What's making the objects be?
Right. And then so in the context of self-compassion, when you're embodying, as you call it, the compassionate mentor, or you can call it loving awareness, you can call it your compassionate self. I know in internal family systems, some people may be familiar with that. They call it self with the big S. It's like you're flipping into that sense of self, which is much broader, which is much bigger, which is connected to everything, and then holding the suffering of our more limited self, or our personal self. And that's partly, I would argue, how it works. But what's really fun is you and I are looking at ways to actually help people learn that.
Yeah, really. I think one of my favorite things about working with you, Kristin, is you're just a master of making things accessible and simple. And I think you and I are in agreement that often these conversations can feel very heady. They can feel disconnected from our everyday life. Okay, great, we're all one, but what does that have to do with making a salad or paying my bills or working out a conflict with my partner? And so I feel so grateful that we're in this conversation that's coming to the heart of the simplicity behind what we're pointing to today, and then really touching, and how does that apply to my life? How, as you said, Kristin, wouldn't it be an amazing thing if everyone in the world were just a little bit kinder to themselves, right? We don't even have to talk about liberation in this call. Let's just picture what the world would look like if negative self-talk weren't dominating everyone's internal landscape. And I should put everyone in quotes, right? Like, we all struggle in different ways. And for some people, their struggles aren't based necessarily around negative self-talk, but it's predominant. We see that with the teens we work with. When we do our surveys, we learn that what the young people are up against regarding their internal landscapes is leading to so much isolation. And these practices, and as you know, we draw upon many of yours, these practices of self-compassion, these practices of being able to recognize who we are, that is bigger than that mind of limitation, are life-changing, game changers, shift the direction of a young person's life. And as you know, Kristin, it's never too late, right? So I didn't have that tool when I was in 10th grade, but that I found it later in life, that's been a game changer.